Hey guys, I hope you're all doing well and that you're adjusting to sort of the new reality that we're having this spring. Now, before we left off and when we were back in-person classes, we were talking a little bit about how the outbreaks of plague during the 1300s really helped shape European society. And today, what I want to do is take a little look at not just the details of how that disease functioned, but the changes it made to society after it came through. So I want to take a look at the consequences of the plague in Europe. Now, what's first and most important to realize is that plague didn't represent a single event. Plague really came in cycles, and those cycles kept repeating every 10, 15 years. For example, the initial outbreak of plague in England that struck in 1349, 1350, that killed roughly 50% of the population. Now, there's a great question. How do we know what percentage of the population was killed? There weren't accurate census records or anything like that. Well, the best estimates that a lot of people have are based on church records. You look at how many priests were replaced in a normal year versus how many priests were replaced in the plague years, and we can get an idea of how the death rate changed. Now, in those initial outbreaks, roughly 50% of the population died. More in some places, less in some places, but that 50% is a good guess. Now, plague recurs. In 1361, we see a recurrence of the plague, and that time there's a 20% death rate. In 1369, another wave of plague, a 13% death rate. 1375, 1390, 1399, 1405, etc., etc., etc. We see these waves of plague happening again and again. Now, each time, we generally see a decrease in death rate. There are occasions where the death rate goes back up. We get a plague in the 1470s where we have about 20% mortality. But at the same time, generally each one is less severe than that initial wave of plague. Now, one of the questions is, why is that happening? Well, a couple of things to keep in mind. First off, there was this overpopulation and what was known as the Great Famine that happened in the generation just before the first outbreak of plague. So in the early 1300s, you have a lot of famine. Basically, the people are primed for a terrible outbreak of disease because they're simply very ill and malnourished, and they're clinging to life. There are also these climatic changes where we see a rainy, colder period and crop failures and things like this. So basically, people's health is poor to begin with. But more than that, it's really a case of this host and pathogen coevolution. The people who survive the initial outbreak of plague, well, many of them may be immune to the plague because they've encountered it before. They also are simply the people who have the strongest immune systems. Moreover, the plague that kills most isn't the plague strain that's going to spread. The plague strain that spreads is going to be the plague strain that makes you sick and gets passed on, but doesn't necessarily kill you. So we see an increase in the resistance of the human population and a decrease in the virulence of the plague bacteria. Now, in addition to bubonic plague or pneumonic plague or all the various varieties of plague, we also see other diseases working at the same time. So we get things like smallpox, malaria, dysentery, you name it, there are other diseases that are happening at the same time. And with a weakened, ill population, all of these things tend to coexist. In fact, at one point in the 1300s, infant mortality was nearly 50% because of diseases like diarrhea and dysentery and things like this. So in sum total, by 1430, our best estimates are that the European population was something like 25 to 50% of pre-plague levels. That's a pretty dramatic drop. Now, this decrease in population has tremendous consequences for the economy. If you can imagine, everything about society is really going to change. If you took a world and you reduced the population by 75%, it's not just amazing that society changed, it's amazing that society continued at all. So I think thinking about how society changed in response to this outbreak, I think that's a really valuable thing, especially now at a time where we're looking at hopefully a much less severe outbreak, but we're looking and trying to say, how is our society going to look? what sort of economic changes, what sort of social changes may happen as a result of this shared experience that we're having. So economically, the plague resulted in drastic consequences. Now, economists will argue about the extent of this, but it's fairly obvious that with a dramatic decrease in population, land becomes much less valuable. The reason for this is that you don't need as much food to feed as big of a population. So you don't have the workers to work large tracts of land, and there's not the demand to use those large tracts of land. Prior to the early 1300s, basically every morsel of land that could be cultivated was. We see forests destroyed, we see people farming in every possible place in Europe. However, after this time, we start to see a return of forested land. The areas that were marginal for farming, they're abandoned. There simply aren't enough workers to work them. And now we see forest returning. Now, with that forest returning, we see a great number more trees. Now, obviously, that has many consequences. For one thing, you get changes in ecology. We get wolves returning. You have lots of stories of wolves interacting with people that were basically extinct only 50 years before. Now, one of the interesting things is you can see a lot of these stories reflected in old Germanic fairy tales. Like you think the Brothers Grimm kind of fairy tales, Little Red Riding Hood, the cabin in the woods. Well, that cabin probably is a memory of, the old farming cabin that was abandoned by the couple that died of the plague, and then the woods returned. So it's remembered as this creepy place inhabited by wild things, this wilderness returning. We have a very modern view of wilderness as, pristine and wonderful and all of that. Back in ancient times, wilderness was scary. You wanted to have cultivated land. That was a sign that you were in control, that the wolves weren't going to come out of the woods and kill you. So this sort of memory of abandoned lands and decay, that's sort of reflected in these fairy tales that still hang around today. Now, with more trees, less cultivated land, we start to see things like workers having more wood to use for housing. They're able to build better housing. We start to see a variety of other influences for workers as well. For example, it seems like wages went up dramatically. Now, we don't have direct evidence of this. We don't have payroll logs from the 1300s, but what we can tell is that there were controls being placed by the government on prices and wages. We have things like price acts that are trying to fix prices or fix wages for particular activities. Now, why would the government step in and say, you can't charge more than this for a certain task? Well, it's pretty obvious that the only reason you make a law is because some people are doing this and you want to prevent this. So if the government's coming in and saying you can't charge more than this for a particular task, it must mean that there was a bidding war for the services of these laborers. Now, I'm not trying to imply that this was some sort of utopian model where everyone was well-fed and doing well. However, it does seem like with a relative lack of laborers, there was probably a lot more in the way of social equality than existed beforehand. Remember that most nobles, their wealth is in their land. All of a sudden, land is pretty available, right? A lot of people are dead, there's land to spare, and all of a sudden, labor is what's in short supply. So for the common person, this meant an increase in their social standing, and for the nobility, a decrease. Now, we see availability of movement for the labor force. Prior to this, you had a lot of people who were serfs. Basically, people who were not slaves, but they were tied to the land. They were expected to stay on the manor and work for the nobility and weren't really allowed to move. Now, they were kept in place because another noble wouldn't take them. All of a sudden, when labor is in more demand, another noble is much more likely to kind of ignore what happened and say, sure, come work on my land. So all of a sudden, you see an end of serfdom, especially in places where the plague hit hard. Western Europe, where the plague hit much harder, serfdom goes away. Eastern Europe, Russia, serfdom stays, probably because there wasn't such a great depopulation. Now, with people able to move from place to place, all of a sudden, you see kind of a bidding war for the services of these people. You see generally better terms of employment. You see long-term leases of land to common people and things like that. So it looks like peasants are increasing in their sort of demands, in their standard of living. And one of the things that you can see is a variety of peasant revolts and rebellions. These follow in the wake of the plague as people sort of gain access to sort of thoughts of better living. And it's really interesting, if you guys would like to follow up, to look at some of these sort of peasant revolts and see the people and the reasons behind some of these revolts. Now, one of the things that we see is, in addition, if people are making more money, there are going to be more opportunities available for the cultivation of what we call cash crops. Cash crops are things that we don't eat, but instead trade. Now, the classic example in America is something like tobacco, right? You can't eat tobacco. I suppose you could, but you get kind of sick. But you can't really eat tobacco. It's something that's sold as a luxury good. So we see changes in the cultivation of crops because all of a sudden that land is pretty available. We don't have to use every single bit of it to grow food. Now, with people making more money and more land available, we start to see changes in what's grown on that land. We see more animal ranching. Meat is a pretty inefficient way to feed people. The cow or the sheep or whatever has to eat the crops and then stores about 10% of that energy in its meat, and then we eat the cow. So if you wanted just to feed people, feeding people on a vegetable-based diet is probably a better idea. But if you want a luxury good like meat, you can herd and ranch and stuff like that, then take the animals, slaughter them, and feed people the meat. So this animal ranching, rather than wheat cropping or something like that, we see a big move towards that, again with the availability of more land. We also see increase in cultivation of things like cotton, things like wool. So all of a sudden, if you grow a bunch of sheep, rather than wheat, you can now trade that wool with other people. Now, one of the other things that we're going to see, in addition to cash crops, is an increasing mechanization. This increased mechanization is a response to the lack of labor. If you have peasants all over the place, I don't need to have a particularly efficient way to organize my labor. I can just go out there and say, hey, you, and you do this task. If I have a relative lack of workforce, maybe it makes more sense for me to build a machine that's going to save a little labor, but might be difficult to build. A classic example of this is the printing press. If you have a room full of monks, they can copy a bunch of manuscripts. If monks are in short supply, maybe what you need is a machine that you can set letters, pull a lever, and produce a lot of pages one after the other. Now, this printing press is expensive to build once. However, once you do, you're free from those labor costs. So a lot of the changes that we see in the economy, increased mechanization, better conditions for working people, all of these things can kind of be laid at the foot of the demographic changes that came in the response to the plague. Now, I'm not saying that the ancient world looked anything like a modern progressive utopia, but at the same time, conditions for common people, the gap between the super wealthy and the middle class, that shrank as a result of the depopulation coming with the plague. Now, one of the things we can do is we can see this. There's an increasing importance in this merchant class. That's because more people have more money. So all of a sudden, trade becomes much, much more important. You see this merchant class becoming as important, if not more important, than the nobility. And one of the ways we can tell is we see a lot of marriages between nobles and merchant class people. The nobility, they wanted the money that was coming from the merchant class. The merchants still wanted the sort of the titles and the prestige of being in the nobility. So you start to see much more intermarriage. And these social norms, these divisions, start to break down a little bit. Now, what we're going to try to do next time is to look at how it is that we move from sort of a medieval understanding of medicine, these bad humors and evil spirits or whatever it is, how we move from that understanding to a more modern understanding of the germ theory of medicine. So I hope to talk to you then. Take care. Have a great day. See you soon.